how can we adapt therapy to make it accessible and effective for PDA children? That is what I want to talk about today in response to actually two parent questions I got. One of them was, can you tell us more about food school? And the second was, can you tell us more about Cooper's wins? So I'm going to focus on talking about our journey with a specific feeding protocol and occupational therapy, and explain how to illustrate some of the three principles that I think are important for you as a parent who may be taking your child to therapy. Okay, so the first is needing to be flexible. The second is needing to focus on what the actual goal is, right? The goal is not necessarily, in this case, to eat something or follow a protocol in a therapeutic setting, but rather to help your child actually eat outside of therapy. And then the third is be willing to engage in some trial and error. So first I'm going to tell you a story about my son's eating, and I'll start with where we started, which was when he was born. So he was a voracious breastfeeder. He was the chubbiest, multiple rolled little baby because he was constantly eating. And at the time, I interpreted this as like, wow, he's got such a great appetite. But really what he was doing was he was getting soothing, co-regulation, but also oral regulation from breastfeeding. So the only times he wasn't screaming were when he was breastfeeding and when I was in like pretty vigorous motion. So like I would walk all over DC and I would be swinging him all the time while breastfeeding, and every other moment he was screaming much of the time. Okay, so I thought he was a pretty good eater, and you know, we did the all organic food. I did baby-led weaning. I made all the, you know, fancy stuff with organic food, but and he was okay with it. But by the time he was like 2, he started to get more picky. And I doubled down with more traditional parenting. And my anxiety and pressure really escalated him to the point where he almost stopped eating altogether. And we started feeding therapy with him about 3.5 years ago intensively. And so there are really like two schools of thought in feeding therapy. One is more behaviorally oriented. We went with the more exposure play-based, which is the SOS protocol, and that is what food school, quote unquote, is part of. So I'm going to talk to you guys about what food school looks like and how we adapted it to make that protocol for therapy accessible to him as a PDAer. And I also hope this could be a helpful tool that you could give an occupational therapist if your child is having trouble and you're interested in using the SOS protocol, because this is how we adopted it to make it useful for him. So the first thing, the SOS protocol is a 32-step process to get your child used to foods through exposure and to help support them through avoidance in eating and also sensory issues. So it starts with like, can you be in the same room with a piece of lettuce without running away and vomiting, all the way up to can you sit at a table with a piece of lettuce? Can the child touch the lettuce? Can the child bump the lettuce off their head and drop it into a bowl in a playful way? And you get closer and closer to the mouth, and you have 32 steps getting towards the mouth before the child would even ingest the lettuce. And so, you know, especially with young children, the occupational therapists will incorporate a lot of play. Like when we started, I remember my son hammering cereals and putting them onto art projects with glue and being a scientist. And so really like engaging with the food and getting over that sensory aversion, right? And then we were supposed to complement that occupational therapy with the protocol, the SOS protocol at home. So what that looks like is you doing the same food school exposure 6 times a day with them eating at the table and, you know, having their preferred foods and then having the foods that are exposure foods, and then you and the child will practice like touching the food or bumping it off your head into a big bowl or spitting the food into a bowl. And so when we started, we were very strictly following this 32-step process. I did not know about PDA, right? And the occupational therapist obviously did not either. And so whereas it did help with some of the sensory aversions, my son was leveling, as Christy Forbes calls it, or equalizing against the loss of autonomy by these strict rules of the protocol. And so every time he would add in a food sensorily, right, he'd get used to something, he'd actually put it in his mouth, maybe he'd realize he liked it, he would then drop the other foods that he had added because he needed to equalize, because this protocol was putting me and the occupational therapist above him, right? And in the sense that he did not perceive equality, and therefore his threat response went off, fight, flight. Two things are going on, avoidance, but also like physiologically, your body is getting ready to like run away from a lion. So you lose your appetite, might have diarrhea, you might throw up, right? So like not going to eat in that situation. But I did not know that. And then the second thing was just the strictness of the protocol itself was a perceived loss of autonomy. So once we realized, and I was very lucky to have a wonderful occupational therapist who introduced me to the possibility of PDA during the pandemic, the very, very early pandemic. Actually, she had said it earlier, but I was like, I can't handle any more acronyms at the time. But she and I really worked together to like drop the strictness of the protocol and hone in on the principle, right? Which is like reducing fear and sensory aversion of food and getting used to it in a very flexible way. So here are the things that we changed, just to give you an example and an illustration of how we can apply this thinking also to other therapeutic situations. So we dropped the like, you have to do it 6 times a day at home, and rather incorporated the like, yes, let's have the exposure, but we're not going to make him like ping it off his head into a bowl and sit at the table 6 times a day, but rather always setting out food that is preferred, but also having some like that can be on his plate or nearby, right? And then at occupational therapy, she had to get really flexible, right? And this can be hard as a therapist if you're studied a discipline, right? Like I'm an academic, I studied the discipline of political science, and like there are certain methodologies and certain authors and certain debates that are like what you do. And so I totally understand this of like, you've learned this is the SOS protocol, but she was flexible enough to say, okay, like we don't have to do it at the same time every occupational therapy session. We don't have to do it at all if he doesn't want to do it. Instead of, having this strict method that we have to go through in a certain order, we're going to keep the principles of it, make it fun, and he can get up from his seat, look in the refrigerator, look in the closet, pick stuff out that she hasn't planned, because the methodology is like, okay, we have a Cheez-It that's hard and bready and orange and crunchy and cheesy, right? You like talk about it scientifically and objectively. Then you have a bridge food that might also be orange, right? Like a goldfish, and you're bridging those foods, right? And so for a kid to get up and be like, oh, I found, chocolate ice cream, it's like totally messing up the therapist's protocol. But she was flexible enough to know that like, okay, the need for autonomy has to override like this strict protocol. So he can roam, he can get up, he can come up with other ideas, he can skip it all together. And he also has a safe food that he can always have after every single like trying food, right? And the trying might just be like he touches it, but he always has like a stack of the food he likes that he can have in between, which is not part of the protocol. Okay, so these are all things we did to take the SOS protocol and the very professional training and deep knowledge of a therapist and adjust it for a PDA neurotype, right? Because the SOS protocol is designed more around sensory, but our kids have sensory issues. And so that is how we adapted it. And I'll give you another example of another therapy. But in terms of wins, for us, Cooper's stickiest basic need is eating. So we have made the least progress on that front. His behavior and his engagement and his other basic needs have really improved, but eating is still a struggle. But he goes to food school, might not try anything, but then he registers like, oh, I want to try that at home. Or he licks it and then he's like, Mama, can you buy me pepperoni? And now he eats steak and he eats Culver's chicken nuggets and fries, and he might have a chocolate milk. And there was a time period where he was eating no protein and I was terrified. So these are our wins. They're going to look different for your family. So let me give you another example of adjusting therapy for a PDA neurotype. So we did neurofeedback with him for 8 months because we were actually orienting it towards trauma, like helping him heal trauma, but I think it helped with executive functioning more than that. But it was a strict protocol, right? Like the kid can't move while the sensors are on their head attached to the computer. We did it at home for 8 months. The child can't move, they can't eat, because if they're chewing, then it like messes up the brain reading. You have to do it for 30 minutes. You have to do it every day. Okay. So as a parent, I'm like, how am I going to get my kid to do this? Like the actual process was him watching a show he liked, and then it would dim or the sound would go down, and then when his brain would go back to where it should be in the brain waves, it would correct the image, correct the sound. So it was like operant conditioning, like very subtle that he didn't notice. So he didn't mind doing that, but like not moving, not eating anything, he's an oral regulator and has a pacifier at the time, and like needing to do it every night. We just had to let go of the strictness of that protocol and negotiate we were working with a chiropractor, financially, like I can't pay for a session if we're not going to use it. And so we worked out that we could just have like a subscription, and however much we used. So it might be five minutes one night. He might skip the next. He might do an hour the next night. He, in order to feel safe to do it, he might have to be chewing gum or eating a sucker. And we just made it work. And that's like, I think the reason I'm emphasizing this is because nothing is really designed for our kids, right? There are a few things, like I think the Safe and Sound protocol is really working on the vagus nerve, and that's very much what I think is going on with our kids. But we have to be the ones to negotiate the adaptations and accommodations so that whatever we're trying to accomplish is not setting off their threat response so much that it's making it impossible to even engage in it. Does that make sense to you guys? I see some waves. So that's what I wanted to talk about today, was just how to adapt therapy and get into the mindset of, it's okay to change. It's okay to change strict protocols and hone in on the principle, which is, helping your child eat or participating in the neurofeedback to some degree. Okay, hope that was helpful.